Welcome back to Worldbuilding Praxis, where we are building a fantasy world from scratch for use as a D&D campaign setting. Last episode, we created the continent atop which our adventures will take place. And in this episode, we will write our setting's history, design a few ancient empires, and divide our timeline into eras. Just a quick note, I hope it's well understood that world building is not just for DMs. You could be creating a setting for a speculative fiction novel, or film, or story in some other medium. You could be designing a video game, or you could just think world building is fun. Regardless, welcome. No matter the intent behind your world building, there will be plenty of overlap between what you're doing and what we cover in my videos. That said, as we go farther in the series, we will increasingly come across steps which are focused on TTRPGs in general and D&D in particular. On that note, there is a section very near the beginning of the DMG titled Core Assumptions. It establishes that in D&D there are gods, magic, conflict, danger, and the unknown. Things without which it is a bit difficult to run a D&D adventure. But after running 5e for 9 years and designing adventures in it for 8, I can tell you that it assumes a lot more than just the things in this section. And there are some other assumptions, specifically about society building species, which we should be aware of before we start writing our setting's history. You do not have to abide by all of these assumptions, but if you choose to deviate from them, keep in mind one of the golden rules of writing. You can break any rule at any time, but these deviations should be intentional and informed, not from a place of ignorance. Also, the things I have chosen to include on this list are exactly that, my choices. These are things which, in my experience and estimation, have the largest ripple effects throughout the rest of the game. First, dragons are often the most ancient intelligent creatures endemic to the material plane. Second, giants are usually not as ancient as dragons, but they're still pretty ancient. At one point in history, they had large empires which have since fallen. They also have had at least one large-scale conflict with the dragons. Aboleths were, at one point, or at least believed themselves to be, the gods of the realm. Before, that is, the current gods showed up. Illithids, or mind flayers, were, and perhaps still are, interdimensional empire builders who now lurk in the Underdark. Elves are from somewhere else. In the current canon, that somewhere else is the Feywild. And the Drow are elves who were banished to the Underdark for some transgression many millennia ago. Once again, you are not beholden to any of these assumptions, and if you want to change any of them, I think I'll have a shorter video on exactly how to do that coming out sometime soon. But for now, let's get building. We make a lot of maps on this channel, and that's not going to change anytime soon. But before we chart our setting's history in space, we need to chart it in time. And to do that, we're going to need a timeline. To establish the scale of our timeline, we are going to start at the present, or the time at which our first adventure will take place, and work backwards. This sounds circuitous, but I assure you it's easier this way. As a reference point, we are going to establish a time in Earth's history which matches the level of development and technology that we want in our setting at the time of our adventure. The classic D&D experience is analogous to somewhere in Africa or Eurasia between 900 and 1200 CE. To keep things simple, we are going to say that our setting's present is analogous to the year 900. So that's where our timeline ends, but where does it start? The beginning of our ancient history is going to coincide with the development of writing systems, seeing as everything before that is prehistory. We are going to assume that the rise and fall of dragons, giants, aboleths, and mind flayers all happened in this era of prehistory, which we are going to leave intentionally ambiguous for now. Using ancient Mesopotamia as a reference, recorded history started around 3100 BCE. This conveniently gives us about 4,000 years of human history in our setting. And if all we had to worry about were humans, we'd be ready to move on to the next step. But we've got a few more things to worry about. In the world of D&D, humans are not the only intelligent species. On top of that, in most canons, humans are relative newcomers to the world of civilization. This assumption, combined with the widely varying lifespans of aforementioned intelligent species, means our timeline is going to be a little more complicated. Another older trope in the genre is that The different humanoid species evolved isolated from each other, still live in mostly insular communities, and really only meld with the other humanoids at trade centers, border towns, and large capitals. It makes sense to me that these species evolved in isolation. That's usually how that works, but these other assumptions are not necessary for you to include. In fact, these assumptions are just not present in many modern D&D settings. It is much more common to assume that multi-species settlements are the norm, while isolationist, single-species settlements are the outliers. How you choose to tackle this messiness is up to you, but we are going to lean towards the second, more modern assumption. Getting back to our timeline, first we are going to assume that dragons and giants are so different from the other humanoids of the continent that their cultures won't overlap as much as they would otherwise. There is some interchange, of course, but when I say empire or civilization, I am almost always referring to those of humanoid-sized bipeds. Second, we are going to assume that a longer lifespan implies a slower cultural metabolism, so to speak. Slower generational turnover, slower population growth, and slower progress. So even though elves live 9 times as long as humans, most of their technological innovations and societal developments will take 9 times as long. Under these assumptions, we can simply divide a given species' lifespan by that of a human, and then multiply the result by 4,000 years to determine when that species' written history began. As far as non-humans go, we're going to focus on elves, dwarves, gnomes, and halflings. But that's mainly because they're the ones in the PHP. If you plan on including any other exotic species as major players in your setting, this process is pretty easily applied to them as well. Also, bear in mind that many other playable species have a lifespan which is comparable to humans, so their timelines will be very similar. We're skipping Dragonborns and Tieflings for the time being because, at least as of 5th edition, they did not evolve like the other races are assumed to. They were brought about by more fantastical means. That said, if you would like to include either of them as a natural endemic species in your setting, feel free. Which leaves our timeline looking something like this. We aren't quite done monkeying around with it though. An important factor to a civilization's development is cultural interchange. Generally, the more interactions between cultures there are, the quicker progress happens. So we're going to cut all of our timescales in half, assuming that, because of cultural interchange, progress is about twice as fast. And finally, to fit our assumption of the elves arriving on the continent from somewhere else, we're going to start their history later than it would have otherwise. Let's say 6,000 years is probably long enough for them to make the journey. I'm going to crunch our species timelines a bit to make our organizer a bit more habitable, while, once again, ignoring dragons, aboleths, and mind flayers, at least for now. But don't worry, they're still out there somewhere. Now let's take a look at our continental map. Moving forward, it's going to be pretty helpful if we map each of our species' ancestral homes. Dragons and giants are assumed to have at one point lived pretty much everywhere on the continent, but have since been relegated to more limited ranges. Our 2 most ancient intelligent species now only live in incredibly harsh environments. Mountain peaks, volcanic depths, even cloud-born castles. Suffice to say, they are mostly out of the way. In 5e, elves are from the Feywild, but are also commonly thought of as living in a temperate forest, so we can say that that's where they landed. Dwarves are known to live among the mountains, and gnomes largely populate hilly, wooded lands, of which we have plenty. Halflings in the 5e tradition can fit in pretty much anywhere, but prefer pastoral communities with quiet farms, so we're going to slip them in pretty near the elves. And on Earth at least, humans evolved to be long-distance runners in the savannas, so that one is a freebie. It's time for step 0 to earn its keep. One thing I stressed when we were doing our big planar stuff was the inclusion of cosmological cycles. And wouldn't you know it, we're going to use those cycles to influence our timeline. How long each cycle takes is up to you. But we've got 16 deities in our pantheon, and our planar system consists of 4 spheres with 4 outer planes in each one. Sounds to me like these numbers should have a bit of cosmological significance. Leaning into the powers of 4 idea, let's say a cosmological cycle takes about 4,096 years, meaning each phase will take around 1,024. These numbers aren't going to function as hard lines, just general trends. Like a lot of real-world cosmological cycles, there is a bit of wobble to them. Remember, these cycles are not prescriptive. You are never restricted by them. Like all of the frameworks we have created for ourselves, they are there to give us ideas in the future, not to constrain us. I like to think of cosmological cycles like Milankovitch cycles. They're there to give us a general feel or climate of a particular slice in our setting's history. And now and then an interdimensional cataclysm. How you allow your fundamental phases to influence the climate of your setting is up to you. The 4 phases we'll be using for Praxis, peace, war, duality, and melancholy, are pretty easily adaptable to the tides of large-scale political powers. Peace speaks for itself, and war does too. Duality will be a period of more than one competing power, with lots of tension and subterfuge. And melancholy will be a condition of devolution, with a downturn in the amount of centralized power. Not necessarily a dark age, but trending that way. Once again, these are just general trends. We will assuredly have some peace in our war phase, some war in our peace phase, and so on and so forth. It might seem pertinent to now designate some historical eras based on the cosmological cycles we have overlaid onto our timeline. But natural phenomena do not write history. People do. Going forward, we are going to be operating under the assumption that countless societies, civilizations, and cultures have popped in and out of existence on our continent, all influencing each other along the way. We are going to leave most of these civilizations unnamed and mostly unthought about, partially because it is not the most efficient use of our time at this stage of the process, and partially because if, at some point in the future, the need arises for another ancient civilization, we will have plenty of room for it on our timeline. The civilizations we will be thinking about are empires. Because the word has a million definitions, when I say empire, I mean a widespread political entity which, through either conquest or diplomacy, has expanded to include multiple societies which operate under a central government. And in D&D at least, there is an implied addendum to this definition. Ancient empires, or at least the ones important enough to make it onto our timeline, could make magic items. Assuming we are making a medium magic campaign setting, most, if not all, of the magic items your players find were created by one of the ancient empires we are about to design. We are also concentrating on empires because their remnants, be they architectural, technological, or cultural, will be much more widespread than those of a society with a more limited reach. While designing our empires, we should keep this in mind, and keep an eye out for physical aspects of them which might influence our current map. For example, many modern roads follow very similar routes to ancient roads, even if no physical part of the original remains. Similarly, many modern towns and cities are located at the sites of ancient settlements. Sometimes certain parts of the old city are still standing, but a lot of the time the new city was built literally on top of the old one, leading to ancient structures being accidentally uncovered during construction. Not to mention, the cities and towns of our ancient empires which are now abandoned are pretty easy for us to convert into ruins and dungeons. We'll talk more about this in step 4, when we design our setting's current map. But mapping our ancient empire's cities and roads can really speed up some of our future world building. The first thing we need to know about our empires is where, or more aptly, when on our timeline they belong. You can align them with your cosmological cycles, roll a d100, or just plop them in wherever. You don't have to do this, but I like to have at least 2 of my major empires' lifetimes overlap. A large-scale conflict between 2 superpowers in our setting's past can provide some very fertile ground once we get to adventure writing. Now let's get to know our empires themselves. We're going to be using a few tables to roll certain aspects of our empires, so it strikes me that there are a few things I should mention about this process. Whenever you use a random table to roll something for your world or your game, you are not beholden to the outcome. The table is there to kick your imagination into gear, not to limit your creative process. If the result of your roll doesn't really make sense or just isn't all that interesting, you are allowed to roll again. Also, just because you use a table for one step of the process does not mean you are obligated to keep using it. If and when you have a better idea, go with it. Every single time. The first table we'll be using I have unabashedly stolen from the game Stellaris. We are going to use it to roll our empire's ethics, or the driving principles of its government. Now, you don't have to roll with this or any table. If you want to keep things purely D&D, you can roll an ideal, but I've found that this particular parameter is a little better suited for individuals than large multi-person entities. I've been keeping track of what we've built in the series using OneNote, and honestly, it's pretty nice. I'm usually more of a paper and pen kind of guy, but for Praxis's purposes, it has done everything I've asked of it. For our first empire, I have rolled the pacifist ethic. Next, we are going to roll our empire's defining technology. As I mentioned before, D&D assumes that each of these empires held the secret of some magical technology which is no longer replicable. This technology isn't the empire's only innovation, but it's the one they're most known for. For this step, we'll roll on two tables. The first is a D&D classic, the Schools of Magic. The second is a table of my own design. These are not the only aspects of a civilization which could benefit from magical technology, but they're a good start. I ended up rolling necromancy on the first table and food and agriculture on the second. A pacifist empire with an integral necromantic technology is interesting to say the least. What I came up with was a kind of bio-battery system, which set up small canals filled with algae whose life is drained to bolster the growth of the empire's food crops. This lays the groundwork for some nice adventuring opportunities later on. Ancient ruins where the only thing that still works is that life-draining technology. That sounds to me like a good obstacle for a player party to traverse, or the site of an evil upstart who has repurposed that technology. Only it's not algae they're draining life from. Next, our empires need some infrastructure. It may not seem like the most interesting bit of riding fuel, but for an empire to function as such, there needs to be some degree of connectedness between its major city centers. This is doubly important for us as world builders because these large-scale projects are often what will have stood the test of time, and which are still influencing our setting's current map. Since we have already established its defining technology, let's extrapolate from there and decide how our empire would have connected its major cities. These systems of infrastructure don't have to be fantastical themselves, but I decided on a grown road system, where one of the aforementioned life drain channels was dug, filled with water and algae, and used to grow a self-maintaining biohighway. Next, we're going to roll what I call a recurring historical theme. This is another table of my own design. It's composed of very human trends which have affected many large political entities throughout history. These themes aren't magical or cataclysmic, but mundane issues like these can give your empires some human, or at least humanoid, depth. In this instance, I have rolled in encroaching nomadic people, who themselves have been driven from their own territory by some third entity. Due to our empire's placement on our timeline, I figured said encroaching tribe could be dwarven. We don't have to know exactly what is driving them from their territory. We can leave that as a placeholder, to be filled in by one of our adventure's B-plots in the future. Once again, let's extrapolate from what we already know about our empire, how they would have dealt with this situation. Since we established that this was a largely pacifist society, most of the dwarven nomads were welcomed. But perhaps certain factions within our empire were suspicious of a much more warlike culture, and maybe a few of these factions broke away, using what was once a peaceful technology to construct nigh impenetrable, life-draining fortresses. It's always good, when designing large groups of people, to put ourselves in the shoes of the most benevolent individuals of the society, as well as the most malevolent. because all societies have both. Finally, we should decide on an aesthetic for our empire. This is just a general look and feel to its architecture and technology. Establishing an aesthetic gives us a defined headspace to enter when designing something created by that empire. Our pacifist, bio-road-growing, mostly elven empire is going to make many pieces of furniture and dwellings out of wood. Most of their magic items were not carved into a particular shape, they were grown into them. You don't have to draw anything to establish an aesthetic, you can just use a textual description or even just a color scheme. Anything that differentiates the general feeling of this particular empire from your other ones. Since we know that it was mostly an elven empire, which had plenty of contact with dwarven tribes, we're going to locate it in this nice temperate forest, between the ancestral homes of the aforementioned species. Our second empire is significantly less peaceful than our first, as we have rolled the militarist ethic. Our defining technology was a combination of evocation magic and prosthetic body modifications. This one kind of writes itself. A bunch of war-hungry magical cyborgs gives us a pretty clear direction for the rest of our empire's design, as well as some easy ideas for magic items. The historical theme we've rolled is one I call Rotten to the Core, wherein an empire expands too quickly, to the point where it cannot properly protect its subjects. This leads to an overdependence on local sources of military strength, as opposed to the central government of the empire. Pretty soon, what was once a centralized power has devolved into a complicated feudal system. As for our empire's infrastructure, since its citizens are capable of massive feats of strength thanks to their body mods, giant slabs of masonry can be moved with relative ease. We'll use these stones to create our empire's roads. Our militaristic, increasingly feudal empire of super soldiers will live in depressing cities of grays and beiges. Their homes are constructed of the aforementioned large, hard-edged blocks of stone as well as concrete, resulting in a brutalist look, minimally lit by low-to-the-ground, utilitarian street lamps. This empire's magic items will retain the same severe style. My first inclination when thinking about the body mods themselves was to make them all out of organic, growable materials. Keeping with our color scheme, said items will be made of pale white bone as well as dull black monster chitin. The first of our two contemporaneous empires has the xenophile ethic. While at first it may seem like this means they are the good guys, things are rarely this simple. Remember, each of your empires will contain the best as well as the worst intelligent life has to offer. For our technology, we've rolled illusion and energy production. And what I came up with was simulacrum pack animals. Simulacra are magical facsimiles of creatures made almost entirely out of snow and ice. A system of nigh inexhaustible energy, which is only capped by its horsepower, led me to think of a huge system of mechanical energy transfer through the use of horse mills, gears, and axles. Since simulacra are created with ice, we are probably looking at a largely montane civilization. So its infrastructure will need some verticality to it, in addition to traversing pure distance. I'm thinking an expansive system of pykrete minecart rails between vertically expanded cities, inhabited with countless mechanical elevators and cable cars to handle the mountainous terrain. We've rolled an 8 on the historical themes table, so this empire maintains a very stratified society, which provides it with short-term stability and simplicity, but restricts progress in the long run. And in order to maintain this system, perhaps an organization of highly trained illusion mages operate in the shadows, watching and policing the empire's inhabitants. Needless to say, these things probably breed some resentment among its people, as well as a lasting cultural resistance to central government. The echoes of our ancient empires are not all physical. Be on the lookout for ideologies which might still exist in the people of your setting, as well as factions which could, over a few thousand years, turn into secret societies and ancient orders. Since the denizens of this empire will live among the snow, their buildings will need some pretty serious insulation. I like the idea of there being two discrete looks to this empire. Deep hardwoods, warm fireplaces, and cushy furniture on the inside, cold mechanical wrought irons and icy steels on the outside. This duality could also be reflected pretty easily in its magic items. Our final empire has rolled the egalitarian ethic, giving us a nice counterexample to the stratified nature of our previous empire. But once again, this doesn't mean they are the good guys. Its defining technology is an application of enchantment magic to building materials. I've always liked the alien, or alien to me at least, look of baobab trees, so we're going to say that a magical species of these trees is used for most of the empire's construction, but also has magically mind-influencing properties. Already a creepy, cult-like empire is taking shape. Our psionic sovereignty depended on these mind-altering trees to keep things running smoothly, so there are going to be as many around as possible. We're going to have this empire establish a network of deep canals, all lined with these brain-hacking trees. And to make sure they have enough rainfall to maintain these canals, we're going to locate this empire largely in our tropical region. We've rolled the retake the homeland historical trend. Oftentimes, nations consider all territory they or their ancestors have ever controlled as rightfully theirs. Apply this assumption to all of the nations in a particular region, and you will end up with a lot of overlapping rightful borders. This status of not currently controlling such an important area is often used to galvanize a nation, mobilize an economy, and, of course, go to war. Since we've situated this empire on top of our previous empire on the timeline, this territory is likely tied to a large-scale conflict between them, so we're going to make a note of that on our map. The aesthetic of our creepy tree empire will be just that. Dreamy while off-putting and cultish. Fluvial settlements, wooden abodes with a simple communal feel, all with an undercurrent of an unseen thought police, making sure everyone is staying docile and compliant. Its magic items will be eclectic, but will often have a component congruent with the empire's peculiarities, like psychic links, empathic sensing, and maybe even some light thought control. We've put off this step long enough. We need to name our empires. And to do that, we're going to need some naming languages. Languages in D&D are weird. When making a character in 5th edition, and I don't foresee this changing in 1 D&D, your characters will choose a language from a list. This list. In the rules as written, as of 5th edition, languages follow species lines. Elven, Dwarvish, etc. We touched on this earlier, but this really only makes sense in a setting where humanoid species rarely, or only very recently, came into contact with each other, and where each species exists as a single insular society. In reality, language is a part of culture. Therefore, it is dependent on geography, time, and cultural interchange. Languages are alive. Every time they are used to communicate, they change and borrow and omit and evolve. I think I might make an entire languages in D&D video, but we're getting a new edition in a couple of months, so I'm gonna hold off. For now, we are going to work within the flawed arena which has been provided to us. If you are building a world to a different end than to eventually run D&D, your options are considerably more open. But for this series, we're going to keep things brief-ish, and in concert with the character sheets your players will bring to the table. Which means we're using this list. The core books don't give us much in the way of information about these languages themselves. They give us some common names from which we could maybe suss out a phonology and not much else. In the DMG's rather concise section on languages, it gives us pretty much free rein to change whatever we want, which we are going to do anyway, but it's nice that we have its blessing. So if we want naming languages, which are actually helpful to us during the world building and adventure writing processes, we've got a bit of work to do. Your first option is to design all of these languages yourself. I have dipped my toe into conlanging in the past, and honestly, it's pretty interesting and really fun, But unfortunately, for those of us who actually want to play D&D, it is also incredibly time-consuming. So if you are an experienced conlanger or a polyglot or a linguistics grad student, you can probably churn out a few naming languages relatively quickly. For the rest of us, I would recommend a slightly more time-efficient approach. Luckily for us, there are already a lot of languages out there, and a lot of them are on Google Translate. What I have done in the past is to take the language in which I run the game, which for me is English, and consider that common, and then work backwards through the language family tree, assigning real-world languages to those of our setting based on their distance, be it temporal or spatial, from where we started. There are a few things to consider if you opt for this strategy. First, Tolkien's influence is still felt in almost every corner of the medieval fantasy milieu, and languages in D&D are no exception. The phonologies which exist in 5th edition are very similar to those of the languages of Middle-earth. If you want your naming languages to have a similar feel and phonology to those in the core books, Tolkien's Elvish languages were influenced by Welsh, and his Dwarvish was influenced by Hebrew, even though more and more Scottish Gaelic has crept its way into the Dwarven fantasy trope library over the years. Second, and I probably don't have to say this, but be respectful. Probably don't use any languages which are exclusively for ceremonial or holy purposes. Also, I've been operating under the assumption that all of the humanoids in your setting are of similar intelligence, and that their cultures are vibrant and diverse, inhabited by the good, the evil, the erudite, and the uneducated. If one of your species or cultures is purely evil or only exists as the butt of a joke, I would consider assigning a real-world language to it rather rude. Not to mention, one-dimensional cultures like this are just lazy world building. For Praxis, we'll be using this second solution. In addition to the aforementioned Elvish to Welsh and Dwarvish to Hebrew, we'll be using the following as our in-game naming languages. Giant being likened to Icelandic is not an original idea. I'm not exactly sure where this trope arose. The Norse tradition is not the only one to include giants, but this particular flavor of giant seems to have taken hold in the genre. Old English for halfling assumes a close historical relationship between them and humans, which makes sense to me, but you are more than free to go in a different direction. As far as Hausa and Azerbaijani go, their general position on the language tree reflects their cultural proximity to the other languages in our setting. As far as these specific languages, it's just personal preference. I happen to find both of them rather pleasing to listen to, so that's what we're going with. Taking another look at the tree, it implies that Halfling, and by extension Common, was heavily influenced by Giant, as well as Elvish, with a slight influence from Draconic. Dwarvish and Gnomish are rather closely related, but are of a totally different lineage than our other languages. One thing we've sort of skated past is the temporal dimension to language. I mentioned earlier that languages are always evolving, and our ancient empires were a long time ago. The way I've solved this in the past is by giving each major language an ancient variant. How you actually treat them in-game is up to you, but for naming purposes, I usually assume they have similar phonologies to their modern variants. And if a character who speaks the modern variant tries to understand the ancient one, it'll usually take a history check. As far as actually naming our empires goes, we get to have a little fun. If you start digging into why certain empires or cultures are named what they are, you find out pretty quickly that a lot of times we don't really know. Even if these toponyms or demonyms were at some point used as common vocabulary, they have since morphed into a word which is effectively only used as a name. One thing you can do is look up your naming language's phonology and play around with the sounds a bit until you have something that you think sounds nice. Alternatively, you can do what we're going to do for Praxis. Roll on this table and translate the output into that empire's naming language. For some added immersion, you can mess around with the word a bit, mash it up, add or omit some syllables, and swap some consonants, all to simulate a few millennia of derivation. Now that we have our naming languages, we can go back and remove the placeholders we've used in earlier steps, namely the deities in our pantheon. These languages will also help us name the geographic regions of our continent, which we will tackle in step 4. We're going to use a similar process, assigning each deity a name based on the in-fiction language which fits it best, thematically or proximally. And then we're going to monkey around with it a bit until it is no longer a recognizable piece of that language's vocabulary. Now that we've got names for them, we can jot down the 2 most commonly worshipped deities in each empire. In the most common D&D religious systems, most cultures will worship most gods. But I think it stands to reason that 1 or 2 could have a little more representation than the rest. Knowing which deities were most popular in each empire will give us a nice springboard when we design any ancient temples or ritual sites. Since our ancient empires are exactly that, they are not around anymore. No matter how stable a civilization seems, it is never invulnerable. So far, all our empires have a time at which they began, but they also need conclusions. Sometimes empires fall because they have an internal, fundamental flaw which gives them an expiration date. Sometimes they fall because of some unforeseeable freak occurrence. But a lot of the time it's both. Some internal flaw was simmering for a while, which weakened the empire to the point at which it could not weather said freak occurrence. Speaking of freak occurrences, it's time to spice up our timeline with a few world-shaking events. The table we'll be using is from the DMG, but since we're assuming that all of these events are of mythical or legendary scale, we are only going to roll a D8. Some of these rolls point to a second table. We aren't going to go over each and every one of them, but they are all in the campaign events section of the DMG. Sticking with our theme of things happening in 4s, we are going to roll 4 world-shaking events. The things which inhabit this table often lead to times of upheaval and change, so we're going to lean towards them occurring near the thresholds between our cosmological phases. These events did not necessarily directly cause our empires to fall, but they probably have at least something to do with them not being around anymore. Remember, what we actually roll on the table is much less important than the work we have already done getting to know our empires. So think about each one's flaws and how those flaws may have been exacerbated by the world-shaking events we are about to roll. Our first roll is a storm. Because of the Kuliad Empire's location, we're going to go with a cataclysmic tsunami. If you recall, this was the mostly pacifist empire, which had several isolationist fortress-building offshoots. Maybe these fortresses housed the only Kuliad societies which survived the tidal wave. Now, these are small, unconnected entities, so the empire was assuredly destroyed, but maybe a few of these fortresses persisted for a while as ad hoc feudal epicenters. And even if their original inhabitants are long gone, who's to say that these fortresses haven't since been repurposed by upstart nobles or warlords? Once again, this is the kind of thing we should be on the lookout for. Ways in which the ripples created by our ancient empires are still felt in our setting today. Our second roll is an interesting one. Our militarist Hevingvat Empire has also been struck by a wave. Not of water, but of a new philosophy. Perhaps this new wave had something to do with the Empire's constant wars of conquest. Or maybe it had something to do with the technology used to wage them. Since the Hevingvat Empire was already experiencing a devolution to feudalism, I think we can squeeze in both of these interpretations. One faction retained the militaristic nature of the empire, but became averse to its body-modding technology. Maybe a cultural shift to a new preferred deity led to the prosthetics being considered profane or unholy. Another faction experienced the opposite. It kept on with the body mods, but rejected the militarist tradition, fully repurposing the technology for more peaceful applications. So part of the empire fell due to a cavalcade of wars, many of which were lost because it lacked the military power it once had, and the rest of it simply melded into several other nearby societies, where the secrets of said technology were eventually lost to time. As far as the Hevingvat Empire's ripple effects, maybe one of these factions still survives. The sole curators of the remaining pieces of this once fearsome technology have since become an order of pacifist monks, devoted to preventing them from ever being used for conquest again. Our third role on the world-shaking event table has brought rebellion to the Esbor Empire. Our simulacra-powered ice punk civilization was heavily stratified, which often leads to stagnation, and in this case, revolution. Constantly at war with the ever-expanding Stolith Empire, perhaps those in the lower strata of Esbor society were tired of being sent to the front lines. In a swift upheaval, droves of simulacrum beasts of burden were removed from their yokes and ridden on the Esbor capital. Nearly overnight, what was once a frigid empire became a fractured state. The rebellion made the average Esbor citizen's life much better, but made waging a large-scale war impossible. After the revolution, much of the Esbor technology still worked, but the simulacra depended on a massive supply line between the Empire's ruby mines and its glaciers. Without the requisite materials, eventually all of the simulacra were gone and could not be replaced. With the Esbor's power source dying out, its towns and cities eventually became more and more disconnected, not only by way of the old Empire's technology and infrastructure, they became more culturally remote as well. But, unbeknownst to the revolutionaries, with the Empire's fate written in stone, the remnants of the Esbor Secret Service enacted a desperate plan. Which brings us to our final world-shaking event, an extinction or depletion. This role ended up being a bit of a happy accident, as our fourth ancient empire, the Stolith, depended on magical baobab trees to power their widespread, society-placating enchantment magic. As we established a few moments ago, our frozen industrialists fell to internal revolution, but not before its secret service put in motion its final operation, a magical, self-replicating plague, which only affected a single species of organism, the Stolith Empire's magical baobab trees. The plague spread quickly and easily. With the Stolith Empire's uniting force gone, it dissolved slowly and without excitement. What were once the cornerstones of a connected empire simply became towns with similar folklore, rich with stories of the mighty baobab trees, which used to line the rivers of a great empire. As our empire building comes to a close, we can see the foundations of our setting's current map, and the likely locations of capital cities and major roads. We also have a few sites which are ripe for conversion into ancient ruins or perilous dungeons. This step of the world-building process has brought some humanity, as well as some drama, to our setting's history. And now that we are in touch with that drama, we can get into the minds of Praxis' historians, and we can divide our timeline into eras. These divisions are not units of geologic time. We are not marking the delineation between strata of rock or before and after a particular species went extinct. Our setting's eras will denote the feeling and general understanding associated with a particular segment of history. The actual word you use to describe each of these segments of your timeline is up to you. Many of these terms have accepted meanings in relation to geologic timescale, but since the historians of our universe are not bound to them, neither are you. This is me giving you permission to use whatever term you think sounds nice. We're going to start with a good old golden age, the times after the giant and dragon wars and before the dwarves showed up on the stage of civilization. There were certainly times of trouble, but the elves and gnomes lived largely in peace. These times are often looked back upon with rose-colored glasses, romanticizing a time full of very real and constant struggle. Even though there was little in the way of large-scale conflict, most humanoid species were hunter-gatherers, living harsh lives, constantly at odds with the myriad dangers of the wilderness. The rise of the Hevingvat and the large-scale militarization of the continent ushered in the Second Age. For the first time, large-scale military campaigns were possible, and the aforementioned empire happened to be very good at waging war. This catalyzed a continent-wide arms race, forcing otherwise decentralized territories to unite or be conquered. The Hevingvat Empire eventually collapsed inwards, but the continent would never be the same. Finally, the modern era started with the burgeoning of human civilization. Compared to those which had come before it, human society was an aberration. A species which, for so long, had consisted of small nomadic tribes, exploded onto the world stage, seemingly overnight. Humans' ability to adapt, assimilate, and expand allowed them to reach every corner of the continent in a matter of centuries. The Hevingvat Empire was feared by all at its peak, but the Esbor and Stolith empires were different beasts, propagating at rates the likes of which the continent had never seen. It's been several centuries since the two great human powers destroyed each other, but echoes of their territories still exist. Rumor has it, there are thousands of unused machines littering the Esbor Mountains, just waiting for someone to dig them out of the ice. And many miles away, there have been whispers of an isolated grove deep in the rainforest, populated by strange trees which can influence the minds of those around them. This part of the world building process, where the ideas really start flowing, is always one of my favorites. It always seems that somewhere around this stage, our setting turns from a collection of maps and ideas into a living, breathing world. Suffice to say, our setting is really coming together. By designing our ancient empires, we have given ourselves several distinct flavors of dungeons, ruins, and magic items. We have also established a few of the cultural identities which exist in several of our regions. And, not to mention, I counted at least 3 possible adventure hooks. Our timeline shows how the characters in our setting view its history, and our historical maps show how our ancient peoples interacted with our setting's geography, setting the stage for many of the settlements which inhabit our setting's current map, which we will make next time in Step 4. Thanks for watching, everybody. As always, if you want to support me, you can pick up a copy of Principles of Shamanism on the DM's Guild. Even though, caveat emptor, it very well may be out of date in a few months, but you can always like, subscribe, and all that jazz. It legitimately does help a lot. Plus, it'll help you know when the next video is, which will be for sure in less than 1 month. That's it.